The harbor was silent. Rows of aircraft carriers, their decks once alive with the roar of engines and the organized chaos of war, now floated still in the gray water. Paint peeled from their hulls. Seabirds nested in the empty gun turrets where young men had once stood watch, scanning the horizon for enemy planes that would never come again. August 1945 had brought victory, but it also brought a question no one had fully prepared to answer. What do you do with the largest naval armada ever assembled when the war that created it suddenly ends? The United States Navy possessed nearly 100 aircraft carriers. Some were massive fleet carriers that had fought across the Pacific. Others were smaller escort carriers, built quickly and cheaply to fill urgent wartime needs. These ships had carried the war to Japan. They had launched the aircraft that secured island after island. They had transformed naval warfare forever, proving that the age of the battleship had passed. But now the enemy had surrendered. The need that had justified their construction, the emergency that had demanded their rapid production, had vanished in the flash of atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, the first aircraft carriers began to return home. They brought with them thousands of servicemen, eager to leave the war behind and return to the lives they had left. The ships arrived at ports along both coasts, their decks crowded with men who waved at the crowds gathered to welcome them. But once the celebrations ended, once the crews had disembarked and gone home, the carriers remained. They sat at anchor, waiting. The Navy faced a problem of scale that had no precedent. During the war, production had been everything. Shipyards had worked around the clock. New carriers had been commissioned faster than they could be properly crewed. The industrial might of America had created a fleet designed for total war, not for peace. Now that peace had come, the nation had to decide what to do with ships that had cost millions of dollars to build but might never be needed again. Some answers came quickly. The smaller escort carriers, the ones built on merchant ship hulls and pressed into service as stopgaps, were the first to go. These ships had been designed for short service lives. Their construction had prioritized speed over durability. Many had been built in less than a year. Their hulls were thin, their machinery simple, their accommodations cramped and uncomfortable. Within months of the war's end, dozens of escort carriers were decommissioned. Their crews were reduced to skeleton maintenance teams. Their aircraft were removed and sent to storage depots or sold as surplus. The ships themselves were stripped of useful equipment, anything that might be needed by the carriers that would remain in service. Then they were towed to anchorages and left to wait for a final decision about their fate. The larger fleet carriers presented a more complex question. These were the ships that had won the Pacific War. The Essex-class carriers, built in large numbers during the war, were among the most capable warships ever constructed. They were fast, heavily armored, and could carry large air groups. They had been designed to last for decades. Simply scrapping them seemed wasteful, but keeping them all in service seemed equally impractical. The Navy began to separate its carriers into categories. Some would remain in active service, forming the backbone of a peacetime fleet. Others would be placed in reserve, maintained at a basic level and kept ready for reactivation if another war came. Still others would be considered surplus, candidates for disposal or conversion to other purposes. The decisions were made based on age, condition, and capability, but also on the simple reality that the Navy could not afford to maintain them all. By 1947, the process of demobilization was well underway. More than 60 carriers had been decommissioned. They sat in groups at various naval facilities, their gray hulls forming silent skylines. Some were in the Pacific, anchored in bays where they had once prepared for combat operations. Others were on the East Coast, tied up at the same docks where they had been commissioned just a few years earlier. Walking through these anchorages was like moving through a graveyard of recent history. Each ship had a story. The USS Saratoga, one of the Navy's first large carriers, had survived Pearl Harbor and fought through the entire war. Now it sat quietly, its future uncertain. The USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship in the Navy, waited for a decision that would determine whether it would be preserved or scrapped. The USS Lexington, not the original that had been lost early in the war but her namesake replacement, floated alongside ships that had seen far less combat. But preservation was expensive. Each month a carrier remained in reserve required maintenance, inspections, and a small crew to prevent deterioration. The Navy's budget, swollen during wartime, was shrinking rapidly. Congress wanted to reduce military spending. The American public wanted to move on from war. The carriers, symbols of victory just months before, were becoming symbols of expense. Some carriers found new purposes. The Navy converted several into training ships, using them to teach the next generation of naval aviators. Others were modified to test new technologies, their decks altered to accommodate jet aircraft that were beginning to replace propeller-driven planes. A few were loaned to Allied nations, helping to rebuild the navies of countries that had fought alongside America. But these solutions could only account for a fraction of the surplus. Then came a decision that felt, to many who had served aboard these ships, like betrayal. In July 1946, the United States conducted Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. The targets for these tests were surplus warships, including several aircraft carriers. The Navy wanted to understand how ships would fare against atomic weapons. The carriers, once symbols of American power, would now serve as guinea pigs to measure the power of the new atomic age. The USS Saratoga was among the ships chosen for the tests. She was positioned in the target fleet, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other vessels deemed surplus to peacetime needs. Animals were placed aboard the ships to measure the biological effects of radiation. When the first bomb detonated above the fleet, the blast wave swept across the water. Saratoga survived the airburst, though damaged. The second test, an underwater detonation, proved more destructive. Saratoga sank hours after the blast, settling to the bottom of the lagoon where she remains today. Other carriers faced different ends. The escort carriers, built in such numbers during the war, were the easiest to dispose of. Some were sold back to civilian shipping companies and converted into cargo vessels or tankers. Their flight decks were removed, and their hulls were modified to carry freight instead of aircraft. Others were sold for scrap, their steel recycled into the peacetime economy. By 1950, most of the escort carriers were gone, dismantled or converted, their brief service in war erased by the demands of commerce. The larger fleet carriers proved harder to dispose of. Some remained in reserve for years, sitting in mothball fleets on the chance they might be needed again. That chance came sooner than expected. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and America found itself at war again. Carriers that had been decommissioned just a few years earlier were hastily reactivated. Crews were assembled, aircraft were loaded aboard, and ships that had been gathering rust were sent back into combat. The Korean War demonstrated that the aircraft carrier still had a role to play, but it also revealed how quickly naval technology was evolving. The carriers that returned to service were the same ships that had fought in World War II, but the aircraft they carried were different. Jets were replacing propeller planes. The Navy realized that many of its carriers would need significant modifications to operate these new aircraft effectively. The cost of these modifications forced another round of decisions about which ships to keep and which to finally dispose of. Through the 1950s, the mothball fleets slowly shrank. Some carriers were scrapped after years of waiting in reserve. Others were sold to Allied nations, continuing their service under foreign flags. The USS Vengeance became the Brazilian carrier Minas Gerais. The USS Terrible became the Australian carrier Sydney. Ships built in American yards during the war sailed under new names, serving new nations, extending their lives beyond what their builders might have imagined. But for every carrier that found a new purpose, several others faced the scrapyard. The process of dismantling an aircraft carrier was lengthy and labor-intensive. The ships were too large to simply cut up where they floated. They had to be towed to specialized facilities where workers with torches could safely dismantle them piece by piece. The steel was valuable, but the process was slow. Some carriers sat partially dismantled for months, their superstructures gradually disappearing while their hulls remained in the water, waiting for the final cuts that would send them to the furnaces. A few carriers escaped both scrapping and continued service through preservation. The USS Yorktown, which had fought at the Battle of Midway under the name of her sunken predecessor, was eventually converted into a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. The USS Intrepid found a similar fate in New York City. The USS Hornet became a museum in California. These ships offered the public a chance to walk the decks where history had been made, to stand in the ready rooms where pilots had received their final briefings before flying into combat. Yet even preservation brought compromises. Museum ships require constant maintenance. The salt water and weather that carriers were designed to withstand in active service gradually take their toll when the ships can no longer be properly maintained. Paint fades, rust forms, and the machinery that once powered these vessels through the ocean deteriorates beyond repair. The carriers that survived as museums became monuments, frozen in time, representations of what they had been rather than functional warships. By the 1960s, the last of the World War II-era carriers in American service were being retired. The Navy had moved on to a new generation of supercarriers, nuclear-powered ships that dwarfed even the largest carriers of the previous era. The Essex-class carriers, once the backbone of the fleet, were outdated. Some received life extension modifications and served into the 1970s, but they were performing secondary roles, no longer the fleet's primary striking power. The final Essex-class carrier in American service was the USS Lexington, which served as a training carrier until 1991. Her retirement marked the end of an era that had begun 50 years earlier. By then, the generation of men who had built and fought aboard these carriers was aging. The ships themselves had become historical artifacts, relics of a war that had reshaped the world but was receding further into memory with each passing year. What happened to America's aircraft carriers after 1945 was not a single story but dozens of stories, each ship following its own path through the peace that followed war. Some were destroyed in atomic tests, others were scrapped for steel. A few became museums, many served under foreign flags. The rest simply vanished, cut apart and recycled. Their materials repurposed for a world that no longer needed the tools of total war. In the end, the carriers shared the fate of most military equipment built for a specific conflict. They were products of their time, designed to meet an urgent need that, once satisfied, left them without clear purpose. The nation that built them moved on, as nations always do, finding new threats to address and new technologies to develop. The carriers, for all their power and all their history, became casualties of peace, victims of their own success in helping to win a war that made them obsolete. Today, a handful remain visible, preserved as museums or monuments, but most have disappeared completely, leaving behind only photographs, official records, and the fading memories of those who served aboard them. The ocean harbors where dozens once floated at anchor are empty now, or filled with different ships built for different purposes. The shipyards where carriers were dismantled have moved on to other work or closed entirely. The world these ships were built to defend has changed beyond recognition. What remains is the quiet knowledge that these ships, for a brief moment in history, were essential. They carried the war across an ocean. They protected convoys and launched strikes. They brought young men to battle and, for the fortunate, brought them home again. And when their moment passed, they faded away, as all instruments of war eventually do, leaving behind only traces of the immense effort that created them and the brief, violent purpose they served.